Welcome back after a long theory section, which I hope was really helpful. Now in this one, we will basically continue learning about basic JavaScript features and syntax, but this time with a focus on more modern JavaScript. So we're gonna dive deeper into built-in data structures like objects, maps, and arrays. We will talk about modern ES6+ operators such as destructuring and optional chaining, and we will also take a look at how to work with strings. And all this together will then give you a very solid and important foundation for the upcoming sections and projects. Let's start this section by learning about array destructuring. So as I said in the intro video, in this section, we're basically going to continue learning basic syntax and basic JavaScript features, but now with a focus on more modern JavaScript. And the theme of this section will be to simulate a food delivery application, and in specific one Italian restaurant, which is this starter data here that we already have in the starter files. And so this one is called Classico Italiano. So I already opened up the starter files here for this project, okay? Now, learning complex topics like the ones we're gonna dive into in this section is really best done in isolation. This way, you can understand exactly what I'm trying to teach you without having to think about 5 other things at the same time. And so I'm isolating just this one restaurant and building no user interface, so that we can focus just on the JavaScript language here. And some people will say that this is boring, but believe me, I do have enough teaching experience to know that some topics are best learned in isolation. And for me, the most important thing is that you will actually learn in this course. Now, of course, there are also topics that can be applied to a visual project. And that's why in the next section, we have a really cool project with an amazing user interface where we're going to learn about array methods. But for now, let's focus on built-in data structures and modern advanced operators. And again, starting with array destructuring. So destructuring is an ES6 feature, and it's basically a way of unpacking values from an array or an object into separate variables. So in other words, destructuring is to break a complex data structure down into a smaller data structure like a variable. So for arrays, we use destructuring to retrieve elements from the array and store them into variables in a very easy way. So let's just actually start with a very simple array. And now if we wanted to retrieve each one into its own variable without destructuring, we would do it like this. Let's say we wanted to name them A, B, C, and so we would write the name of the array, which I totally forgot up here. So R0, and then just duplicating this line, which I'm using Command or Option L for. And I'm not sure if that is actually a shortcut in VS Code. Let me see here. And apparently it's not. Let's see here, duplicate selection. So it's this duplicate selection here. And you can set up a shortcut for that. And so I'll just do that. So B, and so that would be element number 1, and number 2 would be C. So that's how we would retrieve these 3 elements. But now with destructuring, we can actually declare all the 3 variables at the same time. So let me show you how. So const, and then we use the square brackets, and so that's because we are destructuring an array. And so now we can declare 3 variables at the same time. And now I'm not using A, B, and C because we already used them. So let's go with X, Y, and Z. And then I will simply set that equal to the array. And that's it. Well, let's actually see them now in the console. Give it a save, and then we need to start our live server. with a new terminal. And actually I can hit the tab key now, and it will then automatically write the rest of the command. Then close that down. And as you can see, here we get the two results, 2, 3, and 4. So the elements of the array. So basically, we write this syntax here, and then this will become the first element of the array, this the second, and this the third. And so this here is destructuring this array here from the right side. Okay, and of course, this looks like an array, but it's really not. It's just the destructuring assignment. So whenever JavaScript sees this here on the left side of the equal sign, it knows that it should do destructuring. Now when you do this, just don't forget to actually also declare the variables using const. Okay? And I also wanted to notice that even though we did destructuring, which sounds kind of destructive, right? The original array is of course not affected. Okay, so we are not destroying here the array, we are only destructuring. So we are unpacking it. Okay, and now let's work a little bit with the data from our restaurant. So here we see that we have a couple of arrays here actually. So the categories, the starter menu, and the main menu. So let's take some elements out of the categories. So let's say, and then the destructuring assignment, first and second. All right. And so now you see here that we do not have to take all of the elements out of the array. So this will just take the first and the second. So it will simply follow the order of the elements here and will basically only take these two. And so now the array from which we want to extract, and that's restaurant.categories. Just to take a look now. And indeed, we get Italian and pizzeria, which are exactly the first two elements of the array. But now let's say that we only wanted to take the first category, so this one, and the third. So let's say that this one is the main category and this is the secondary for some reason. Well, to do that, we simply leave a hole in the destructuring operator. So what I mean is just this. And so now the second element will be skipped, so the one that would go here, and then this second here simply becomes this third element. And now, so you see that second now is vegetarian, which is element number 3. All right. And so like this, we don't have to create variables for all the stuff that we might not even need. So if we only need to take this and this, we just skip the element in the middle. Okay. And this is really powerful, and we use destructuring to do a lot of cool things. For example, let's say that the owner of the restaurant now decided to switch the main and the secondary category. So right now the primary is Italian and the secondary is vegetarian. But now they wanted to switch it. So let's first change the name here to main and secondary, just to make it a bit more obvious. Secondary. And so if we would like to switch these two variables, then without destructuring, we would have to do it like this. We would need to create a temporary variable, and then to that we would assign one of them. So let's say main, and then we could switch main. We would say main is equal to the secondary, and then secondary is equal to temp, because that's where we temporarily stored the value of main, right? We could not just do main equals secondary and then secondary equals main, because by then we would already have overwritten the main variable, right? And that's why we need this temporary variable in the middle. So that's how we would do it. But with destructuring, we can make it a lot easier. And this is how we do it. First, we create an array with both of them, And the first one is going to be the secondary. And then the second one will be the main. And actually, before we do that, let me just show you that this worked. So main and secondary. And so now we should see them switched. Oh, okay. Here we need to change, of course, to let, because we are reassigning here to a const in line 24. So let's try that now. And indeed, what was Italian is now vegetarian, and what was vegetarian is now Italian. So this here worked indeed, but let's now take this out so that we can do it using destructuring. So as I was saying, in order to switch the two variables using destructuring, we would first start by creating a new array with the two variables inverted. So first secondary and then main, and then we can simply destruct them. So main and secondary equals the destructuring of this array. And now we're not using let or const here, because we are simply reassigning the values of the two variables. So just like we did here. But now we do not need a temporary variable in the middle. So let's check now. And indeed, the result is the same. But this is a lot easier. And this is a trick here that I actually use all the time. So let me just show here, or actually write here, switching variables. Okay, so that's a pretty cool trick. And another trick with destructuring is that we can have a function return an array, and then we can immediately destruct the result into different variables. And so this basically allows us to return multiple values from a function. And so let's try that and write a function to order food. So here in our restaurant, let's now add a method, and I'm going to call it order. So this will be a function, and it will accept two parameters. One index for the starter menu, so this menu, and then one index for the main menu. And then the person will order basically by giving the index for each of the menus. So something very simple, just to illustrate the point here. So let's say starter index and main index. Okay, and so we will simply now return the content of the arrays based on the given indexes. So return, and so as I said, we're going to return an array, and then we go to this dot starter menu. Okay. And remember how this keyword here is set, as we learned in the last section. And so now we go to the position of the starter index that we passed into the function. Okay, that makes sense. Then the same with the main menu at the position of the main index that is passed in. All right. So here we are, of course, not doing any destructuring yet, but now is a time where we will do it. So let's call order, or in fact, restaurant.order, and let's use 2 and 0. So we want element number 2 from the starter menu, so the garlic bread, and the number 0 from the main menu, which is pizza. So we're going to receive an array with that, right? Let me just show that to you. And indeed, it is garlic bread and pizza. And so now we can simply destructure that. So this is the destructuring assignment. And so let's say starter and main should equal these two results. So let's log them, starter and main. Oh, and now this was already defined before. So let's just call this one here the main course. And now indeed we get garlic bread and pizza. Alright, so this is how we basically receive two return values from a function. Alright, so of course we could have done that without destructuring and still return an array from the function, but this is a very handy way of then immediately creating two variables out of one function call. Okay, and now that you understand how destructuring works, let's take it one step further. Because what happens if we have a nested array? So let's say nested, and with nested we mean one array inside another. So let's say that we now here have another array 5 and 6. So an array inside an array. And I'm not sure if we did that before, but of course that's perfectly acceptable. So as a small exercise, how can we get this value here and this entire array? Well, we simply define two new variables using the destructuring assignment. Let's call them I and j. And remember that we do not want in the middle. So we just skip it. So simply leave a space and then another comma, and then this one is going to be j equals to the array from which they should be taken. And indeed, we get the number 2 and then the array 5 and 6. Great, but what if we actually wanted all the individual values? Well, then we would essentially have to do destructuring inside of destructuring. So that sounds complicated, but it's not. So let's take out these here, and let's create now 3 variables. So one for this, one for the 5, and one for the 6. So we're going to skip the 4 again. So that's going to be I, then again the whole here, and now here we can destruct this inner array immediately. So we use the destructuring here again, and so now j for the first element and k for the second. So for 5 and 6. And then again the array from which to take. And then let's take a look. And so this should now give us 2, 5, and 6 as separate variables. And yes. So that's how nested destructuring works. Basically, we need to do destructuring inside of destructuring. Okay, and now to finish, there's just another feature of destructuring that I want to show you. So we can also set default values for the variables when we are extracting them. And that's going to be very useful in the case that we don't know the length of the array. And this can sometimes happen in real-world applications, as you will see later. So if we have an array that is shorter than we might think, then we might try to unpack the array in positions that don't even exist. So let me say here just default values, and here nested destructuring. So learning a lot of stuff here about destructuring. And so let's now say that we have this array, 8 and 9, and then we are trying to destructure it. So just pretend that we actually don't know the array, all right? And so we might try to take 3 elements out of the array using, again, destructuring. So let's call them P, Q, and R. And then let's try to lock them all, P, Q, and R. And so now here we get undefined as the third one. So this would basically be the same as trying to read the element at position number 2 of this array. But it only has elements at position 0 and 1. And so therefore we then get undefined. But as I said, we can set default values. So let's simply set them all to 1. And then our R will become 1. Great. And if we remove this element, then Q will also become 1. Okay? And as I said, this can sometimes be useful, for example, when we get data from an API. And so we're going to probably use this one and actually everything that we did in this lecture a bit later in the course. So we talked about destructuring arrays, but we can also destructure objects. So let's do that now. And this time, let's actually write the code before the previous lecture. So right here after this restaurant object, so that we don't have to scroll too much. Also, I added this object here to the restaurant object. And so that was already in your starter files, but I didn't have it here yet. Anyway, let's now talk about object destructuring. And so to do that, we use the curly braces to destructure. So to destructure objects, we use the curly braces, because this is also how we create objects, right? Then all we have to do is to provide the variable names that exactly match the property names that we want to retrieve from the object. So the obvious choice here of object to destructure is restaurant. So let's take the name, categories, and opening hours. So again, let's start with const in order to actually define some variable names. And now, as I said, we need to write the exact property names here to now extract variables from this object. Now, since in an object the order of elements does not matter, we don't need to manually skip elements like we did in an array. So we can simply write name, so that's the restaurant name here, and then also remember that in objects the order of the elements does not matter. And so we can also then take now the opening hours, which is kind of the last property, and only then the categories. And then we simply say equal restaurant. So that's exactly the same as with arrays, but now here we use the curly braces and we have to specify the name of the properties. But just like with arrays, this now creates 3 brand new variables, so based on this restaurant object. So let's see. Name, opening hours, and categories. And indeed, here they are. Okay, so that's the fundamentals of destructuring objects. And once again, this is an extremely useful addition to the language, especially when we deal with the result of an API call, which basically means to get data from another web application like weather data or data about movies or something like that. And this data usually comes in the form of objects, basically. And then destructuring is really a lifesaver. It allows us to write a lot less code. So this is really used in modern applications. But now, what if we wanted the variable names to be different from the property names? Well, we can do it like this. Now, of course, we still need to reference the property names like we did before. Otherwise, JavaScript has no way of knowing what we actually want. So let's write name again, but then we can use the colon and specify a new name. Let's say we actually want it to be called restaurant name. And then here, let's say we want the opening hours, but we want the variable to be called just hours. And then once again, we want to take the categories, but we want the variable name to be called tags. And then again, equal to restaurant. And so the variables that we now created are called restaurant name, hours, and tags. So basically this, and this. And VS Code is nice enough to put them in this purple color here too. And so you see that these 3 are actually the exact same name, but we were able to give them new variable names, which again is going to be immensely helpful when dealing with third-party data. And another useful feature for when we are dealing with third-party data like that, so like an object that we get from somewhere else, for example, an API call, as I was just explaining, it can be really useful to have default values for the case that we're trying to read a property that does not exist on the object. So usually then we get an undefined. For example, if we were trying to say restaurant.menu, this would be undefined because there is no property called menu. We have starter menu and main menu, but not just menu. Okay, and so we can set default values just like we can actually in arrays. So let's say that we are trying to destructuring the menu, and so we use equal to set a default value. All right, and then we can do the same with the starter menu, for example, and then we can even combine this syntax here with what we did previously. So let me show you. So let's say that we're trying to retrieve the starter menu. So this one, but we then want to give it another name. So starter menu, and we want to call it just starters. And we also want to give it a default value in case it doesn't exist. So in this case, just an empty array. Now in this case, it actually does exist. So starter menu does exist, and so therefore this default value will not apply, but it should apply to menu, because as I was just saying, there is no property on the restaurant object called menu. So menu and starters. And so here indeed we get the default value, which is the empty array, and here we get the starter menu. And without this, we would then get undefined, as I was saying. You see? And so this is a nice way of setting a default value. And once again, keep in mind that this is especially helpful when we do not have our data hard-coded like we have it here. So this is just hard-coded data in our application, but in the real world, we usually get the data from somewhere else. And then we might not always know how exactly the data looks like. And so then it's useful to set defaults like this. Next up, we need to talk about mutating variables while destructuring objects. So we did that before with arrays when we were switching variables. Remember that? So let's see. Down here, you see that we mutated these variables that we created before. But with objects, it works a little bit differently. And so let's write that here, mutating variables. And here let's write default values. So let's say that we already have some variables here. So A and B. And then we have this object, which has a property A of 23, property B of 7, and C of 14, let's say. All right. And now we want to destructure this object. And actually, let's first store it into a variable. That makes it a bit easier to work with it. And so now actually let us destructure this array. Now we cannot say const like A, B, because A and B are already declared up here, right? We can also not do let, because again, that would create new variables and we already have them there. Okay, so here we are missing the object that we are destructuring. But as I was saying, we cannot do this. And so, in fact, we want to mutate these variables. So A should become 23 and B should become 7. But now, as we save this, watch what happens. And so we get a syntax error. And the reason for that is that when we start a line with a curly brace like this, then JavaScript expects a code block, all right? And since we cannot assign anything to a code block like we did here with the equal sign, then we get this error unexpected token with the equal there. So to solve this here, the trick is to wrap all of this into parentheses. And so that's the thing that I wanted to show you here. Okay, So now if we log A and B, it will work. So you see, now we get 23 and 7. So basically we did override these two initial variables, but in order to do it, we had to wrap this destructuring assignment into parentheses. All right, and now we already know how object destructuring works, and so now we need to talk about nested objects, just like we did with nested arrays. So let's say we wanted to create two variables, open and close, and these should contain the open and close hours for Friday. Okay, so you see that opening hours is an object, and then in that object we have another object. So this Friday is an object inside an object, which itself is inside the restaurant object. Okay? Now the opening hours is already an object here that we have already stored in a variable. So that's the object that we're going to destructure. So nested objects. So again, we're going to start with opening hours, and now we want to retrieve Saturday. So let's start with doing that. So just Saturday for now. Or actually Friday. So I think I said Friday. So let's see. And so indeed, Friday is this object that we get here. But remember that we actually want two variables, one called open and the other one called close. And this is how that works. So we know that this is an object, and now we can further destructure that object using this syntax. So the colon, and then again the exact property name of that inner object. Okay, so that looks confusing, but that's just the syntax that we have to use. So maybe you don't even need to memorize this, but when you need this someday, and you will, then you can just come to this video and see how it works. And so indeed, now we get our numbers 11 and 23. And we could, of course, take this even further and even assign different variables to these, just like we did up here. So with the colon again. So we could call this one just O, and this one just C. So this is taking it to an extreme. But as I said in the beginning, destructuring is really powerful. So there's a lot of stuff we can do with it, and that's why I'm showing you all of it right now. Okay, and now to finish, let me actually show you a really cool practical application of this destructuring. And for that, we're going to go back to our object here, so to our example of this section, and now we will create another method. So many times in JavaScript, we have functions with a lot of parameters. And then it can be hard to know the order of parameters for someone that is using this function. And so instead of defining the parameters manually, we can just pass an object into the function as an argument, and the function will then immediately destructure that object. So let me show you what I mean. And let's say we want an order delivery. So that's a new function. Okay, and so here let's just for now call this argument object. And then I will log that object to the console here. And now let me call this actually. And I will do it right here so that we can see everything at the same time. So that is restaurant.order_delivery. And now here comes that object of options. So as I said, we can now specify some options here. Let's say the time of delivery, let's set it to 23:30, which is like 10:30 p.m. Let's also say address, Via del Sole 21. And then we also specify the main index and the start index. So a little bit like we did up here in this function, starter index. Okay. Oh, and here we need to also give it some value. Let's just say 2 as well. And so, here, right at the beginning, is that object that we just defined, because here we are simply logging it for now, okay? So what we just did was to call this function here and passing in an object of options. And that's a pretty standard thing, actually, in JavaScript, especially in third-party libraries. Because now, here in the function arguments, we can actually do destructuring right away. So we can now say starter index, main index, time, and address, which is exactly the 4 property names that we have down here. And of course, usually we would first develop the function and then call it, but I wanted to explain you this way of calling a method with an object so that writing the object here then makes sense. All right, and so now instead of the object, since we did destructuring right here, we now actually have 4 variable names. So we can log them to the console, or actually let's do some nice string here. So let's say order received. And then let's get the food. So based on the starter index, let's just copy that from here. So this .starter menu at the current starter index, and then also the main menu. So let's again copy that, actually all of this from here. And we need the curly braces and this $sign will be delivered to, then the address, and then the time. Okay. And so indeed, we get this complete string based on the data that we passed in this single object. Okay. So that's important to realize. We only passed in one object into this function. Okay. We did not pass 4 arguments. It's really just one argument, one object. Then here in the function, as we receive that object, we do immediately destructuring. And so that's why these names here need to be exactly the names that we have down here in the object. But what's great about this is that here the properties in the index don't have to match the order in which we do destructuring up here. And so that makes it really easy for the user of this function to specify basically the arguments. All right. So this is great, but we can even use some more knowledge that we gained here, which is these default values. So we can now use this to basically set defaults here on some of these. So let's say that the starter index will be 1 if it cannot be destructured, and that the main index will be 0 and the time will be 20 hours. And so now as we call this method, restaurant.orderDelivery, I can specify the address again. Let's actually copy it from here. And let me also just specify the starter index. Okay, but then the rest will be taken from the default values that we set here for destructuring. All right, and so here as a second string, we get will be delivered to Via del Sole at 20 hours. Okay, so in this object that we passed, we do not have any property for the time, right? And so then as JavaScript did destructuring, it here took the default value of 20. Okay, and the same happened for the main index that we also did define. So it shows 0, and 0 is pizza, and that's why we get pizza here in the output string. All right. So if you ever need to write a function like this, so a really complex one with a lot of parameters that might be then hard to specify, keep this technique in mind. And this becomes even more useful as the amount of parameters increases.